Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air this evening. I've got next to me a well-known presenter here, Stuart Manins. Hi Stuart.
Hi David and all.
And Max Thompson sitting out there. I'd like to say a word of greeting, Max.
Well, yeah, greetings to everyone. It's good to be involved in another night school session, David. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, to help us get going this evening, I've got a slide share that I'd like to bring up, and this tells us what our questions are. And tonight we're looking at how do you get involved in writing a book? How do you actually get started in this creative process? What lies behind all the books that are produced worldwide? How and what if you want to be part of that process too? So Stuart and I, between us, have written a lot of academic articles. We've written books and plays and goodness knows what. We're going to talk about that as we go through this evening. We're going to start with two interrelated concepts, and that is, how do you plan the process of a book, and also associated with it, what are the genres? And I think genre of books and planning to write a book, they belong somehow together. We're going to also talk about the creative process and finally the marketing process. Now, to give us a kind of a lead in, the photo here is by Brocky of Pohongana, who's recently become a Kiwi Connection far country correspondent. And John Brock is a magnificent photographer. He's a naturalist by trade, and he writes little articles for the Ashurst Pohongana Bunnythorpe Church newsletter called The Messenger, and he liberally peppers his articles with photos like this. And the person in the photo is actually Craig Knight, who I think is, or certainly was, one of the parish stewards of that circuit. And Brocky, in a sense, when he's writing for The Messenger and now for Kiwi Connection in his occasional blog, is doing what we would call photojournalism. That's a genre that can enable us to start to get going with how do you, the viewer, how do you write a book? How do you get going? How do you plan it? What genre are you going to use, etc.? So without any further ado, I'd like to just push over to Stuart. Stuart, you've done a little bit of pre-thinking about this, and you've come up with 7 different steps that somehow involve you in the planning genre stage. I'd like to just very briefly give us those 7 steps, and then we'll talk about them.
Sure. First of all, I thought about times when I wrote just to clarify my own views, not for anybody else, just to clarify my thinking.
There's a couple of marvellous examples that you've done in Kiwi Connection around that, when we had a book by Kenan Malik, which was all about philosophy and ethics, and can we find an ethic for the modern world? And Stuart wrote magnificent kinds of summaries of each chapter. I also contributed a little bit, but not half as much, not even a tenth as much as Stuart did on that. So that was
a good example.
Good example of what you were trying to do.
And that came out of my experience for years. Whenever I got a good book, I would summarize it in my diary. So I had a whole history of these things and that way of working. The second thing is when I felt very deeply about something. In the great changes in education in the 60s and 70s, I felt education planning, curriculum planning, was moving in a direction that tended to ignore some of the unique qualities of the arts in favor of technology and science. And I felt very deeply, and I wrote about that and sent articles to magazines.
So those were sort of, in a sense, journal writings. They were for a professional audience.
They were for an academic journal like Sound Ideas that was put out by Canterbury University.
Aha. Okay, thanks for that. Max, did you ever have any do any writing like that for technical journals?
No, not to any extent. What I find very interesting with what Stuart's saying is it's the step before your four on the thing. It's before the planning. You've got to decide why write, and you're touching on that, Stuart. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, it is. And it's fundamental to these 7 steps. So what was the third one, Stuart?
To inform others. For example, Canterbury University wrote to me once and said, would you submit an article on how children learn music?
And is that where all of the rest of it sprang from?
Well, it came out of, I've been thinking about that question for many years as a lecturer, but it gave me a place, first of all, to concentrate my ideas and produce some, I thought, some helpful diagrams and get it published in a succinct way. And it was published by Sound Ideas, which is the journal in music education put out by Canterbury University.
Okay, so there's a kind of an invitation thing going on there to some extent. What's your fourth point?
Well, I do it if people ask me to do it. This morning I was asked to take the intercessory prayers at church. Not a thing I would opt to do. Not a thing that really interests me. Sometimes it turns me off. But because I was asked, I thought about it. And I did it in quite a different way. Max might make a comment about that. But the incredible thing was, I suppose, in the last 10 years, I've never had such a wave of appreciative people thanking me because they said I did it in a different way.
Any comment on that, Max? Because I think it's a great start for a book. But
yes, indeed.
That was different?
I was lucky to be there this morning, and we had an excellent sermon, I suppose you'd call it, from Greg Morgan. And then Stuart followed on, and it linked so nicely with the concept of thinking about what you're doing and making it useful in action, not just words that flow off the mouth.
Yeah, okay. So there's a fourth example. Now, what are your next 3 points? Give them all in a row, Stuart. So
okay,
we'll discuss
because them. I think something needs to be published on it. I was involved in reconstructing the New Zealand curriculum in music in a way it hadn't been reconstructed for about 20 years. And when I noticed there were gaps in the curriculum, they need to be addressed. And the one I thought I could offer something to was, what are we doing about accommodating an appreciation of the Maori content, Maori music in New Zealand music education?
Okay, so that's writing quite specifically in an educational setting. Yeah. Okay, so there's another context that emerges for someone who wants to kick off the creative process. Okay, number 5.
Sometimes I had to write things because I needed informing. I went overseas for many months in 1982 with a group of Teachers College students, and we were performing medieval and Renaissance music for different reasons I can talk about sometime. But there's nothing there. How do you know what sounds were made in the Middle Ages? Because they didn't have tape recorders. So there was an area of research, and Professor Tom Rive at the university, who's a medievalist, he said, I should have written that years ago before he did his PhD research on Thomas Louis de Victoria.
Okay, so there's another example of actually being involved in a real life situation, a context. You're with a group of students, an idea emerges and it grips you. Next one, thanks, Stuart.
Because I think some people need it. This doesn't happen very often, but it did when I was particularly interested in developing the musical activities of young children. I felt they needed to sing in tune and move in time, and I like reading stories, so I put them together and produced a whole lot of stories for juniors in music education. So it was a specific project.
Okay, so that's our 7 points from Stuart that sort of get us into this idea of how do you plan and what's the genre of what you want to write.
There's just one more comment I'd like to make, and there's only two, but those were prose writing. Poetry was different. It's the one genre I use for my own personal satisfaction. If I just want fun, I write poetry, or a kind of doggerel, really. And the second thing is, by writing doggerel that can be sung to tunes, you have an extra power to communicate. And so I took all my little stories of the Beatitudes and set them to verses which could be sung to different tunes.
Okay, that's an example that we've got in Kiwi Connection of Stuart rewrote the Beatitudes. We called it gospel, and then I challenged them later on, can we produce some hymns? So those are 7 examples of genre that are quite specific to Stuart. And they all have a kind of planning behind them. Once you've got the genre, the plan emerges quite specifically for how you want to write your book, because it's not about the books and so on that we've written. It's about us assisting you to start to write your own books.
And the next question must be, how have you responded?
Okay.
The same question.
Okay, I will answer that in just one moment, but before I do, I've noticed that we've had 3-4 concurrent viewers floating through. We're broadcasting tonight from YouTube rather than Google+. This is just an experiment, and we don't have a live Q&A pod. So unfortunately, you can't feed questions and comments in. I didn't realize that when I set this up, but because of some of the technical difficulties we'd had a few weeks ago, I thought let's have a different way of broadcasting tonight, and we'll just see how it goes. So coming back to your question, Stuart, genres that I've been interested in, well, as a clergyman, I've got to say that whether you're a clergyman, a clergywoman, a deacon, a presbyter, a lay preacher, or whatever, the sermon is one of the most compelling short story presentations. It's in the realm of short story, it's in the realm of journalism, it's in the realm of telling a story. It's all of those things, and it is the most underrated kind of collection of prose that you could possibly imagine. If we went back into the history of the church, back into the history of societies, sermons had a much higher level for appreciation than they do today. But it struck me about back in the very late 1990s and early 2000s that there were lots and lots of really good sermons. I mean, huge quantities of sermons in a worldwide sense, but here in New Zealand, there were lots and lots of very good preachers. And occasionally sermons might get published in newspapers or journals. I remember once I wrote an article on the virgin birth for the New Zealand Woman's Weekly, as it was back then. They published it, and the editor later on informed me they'd never had such a storm of protest about it, and they wouldn't publish me again. But I thought it was a sermon that somehow did communicate. And so I've used the sermon and I've predicated Kiwi Connection on the idea that sermons and the associated things with worship will in fact be highly marketable to certain groups of people that want to be informed in the way that you're talking about, that want to be stimulated, that want to be challenged, that also want to then react to and become involved in the sermons. Max, do you have any input that you want to give on that? You and I started our own publishing house here in the East Coast Bays Methodist Parish, and it was called AIM. You and I are the only, well, we're the sole founders, if you like, of AIM. Any comments about it?
But in terms of AIM, of course, I was only on the mechanical end of putting the books together. What it leads me to ask is, you've covered the genres a lot. Your first topic was the plan. Can you expand a little bit on your planning once you've settled on the genre?
Okay, Stuart, I'll get you to answer that first while I have a bit of a think about it.
Oh, that's a nasty thing to do.
Perhaps we could lead into the how would you start planning and then
plan in terms of what I saw the need was. I mean, if you're giving a book that's going academically out to the world as how to perform medieval and Renaissance music, you just go to the local library and get the services of the head librarian, who gets you the world publications in this area, and you read them all up and you talk to important people and you produce a kind of thing. You plan it like you're writing a thesis.
Okay, now there's a really interesting answer, Max. Stuart always, I think, in all his writing has got that sense of structure that comes out of a very academic sense, or a very academic context, rather. Whereas when I'm thinking about planning something, I've done all of that and I can do all of that. But quite frankly, to me, that's not the way in which a book should be planned. I think genre determines the kind of planning. So given the nature of what Stuart wants to produce, and a lot of people that want to write books do want to output in that particular way. Let me give you an example. I'm going to hold it up here to the camera. It's called The Art of Creative Thinking, and it's by Rod Judkins. And if you were to go into this book, you wouldn't find a preface, you wouldn't find a table of contents, you wouldn't find an index. What you'd find at the bottom of most little sections is the word more, and it asks a question. Do you agree with what has been written here? If so, go to page such and such. Do you disagree? Go to page such and such. And so you're constantly leafing through the book. You may never, in fact, get all the way to the end of it. It's not meant to be written from A to Z, from cover to cover. It's designed to be a far more interactive experience, which is the way I think books are actually read. They very rarely are they read from page one to page wherever. Most times people, particularly if they're technical, how-to, tutorials, that kind of thing, they're usually leafing through trying to find the bits of information they want. They may read, this is the curious thing, they may read a novel or even a collection of short stories from A to Z, but the technical writing that Stuart does is very rarely going to be read from A to Z. Any comment about that, Stuart?
Yes, because that's not the only way I write. Now, when I wrote stories for children, I worked on the principle that it was a reasonable story if it kept kids interested, and it needed to keep them interested, in my reckoning, for the number of chronicle years they'd lived. So my books for 5-year-olds last 5 minutes to read. That's they lose interest after that, like audiences in churches lose interest after about 10 minutes.
Well, the average age of a person, many of the Pālangi congregations, of English-speaking congregations, 80. So would you expect to read to them for 80 minutes?
No, if they can go for 20 minutes, they're doing better than most. They'll be asleep well before 80.
But that doesn't actually get to the heart of the planning question.
Well, yes, it does for me, because then I took my 5-minute story and took it out to lots of classrooms and read it to kids. And any response that said, no, you could have done that better from the teacher, or the kids showed the slightest variation in intense interest, I knew that had to be changed. And I never published one without it working over and over again with lots of children.
Okay, and there I think we've actually moved from planning into something quite different. We've moved into the creative process of writing and editing. And I'm going to stick to my knitting here and say that the planning stage is absolutely crucial. And if you're going to write academic style things, then you do need to follow the steps that Stuart suggested. But in the world of business and the world of creative writing, lots of people will say, actually, it doesn't matter about laying out the plan in that kind of structured way. They'll say, what you've got to do is get to the typewriter, get to the keyboard, get to the notepad, and actually write a sentence. And to that extent, I think the plan of how you're going to write starts to emerge as the idea starts to grow. Now, this is a different way of looking at the planning process. Max, you will have a totally different perspective on how things should be planned from both Stuart and me. I know that you haven't, well, I don't know that you haven't written books, but you've certainly been involved in editing huge technical manuals and things like that. What, as a reader, what do you see as being critical in the planning process?
Well, having a clear direction and follow through of thought. I guess the only bits of writing I do these days are in composing emails that go to local boards and council and things. But there is still that need to try and be clear and to have a follow through of the thought process if you are to communicate. And I guess most writing is to communicate. So do you have any more comments about how you start and the process of doing the writing? You mentioned editing, of course, which Stuart's emphasised.
I'd like to say one more thing, if I may. Take the little episode this morning. What do I write when I normally wouldn't do this kind of thing willingly? And I thought, I need to start off with something interesting that captures attention, and that for me comes from real experience that I've had. And that led me to what I did this morning.
Okay, I think that's actually quite a good lead-in, that no matter what we're writing, what genre, what audience we have in mind, we do have to start from something that's real to ourselves. Now, Max, if I could just go back and attempt to answer your question, often in creative writing, things aren't clear. And I think this is the biggest single problem area that we have in church life. In fact, I think it's the single biggest issue that has caused Christianity to go onto a spectacular path of radical disenchantment rather than radical enchantment with the Bible. Because the Bible hasn't gone through the kinds of planning processes that you and Stuart are outlining. It's certainly gone through major editing and all kinds of contextualization and so on. But the stories of the Bible are often confusing. And the genre of fiction, the genre of stagecraft, writing a play, the genre of opera, the genre of poetry doesn't necessarily have intellectual clarity. What it communicates is emotional magnetism. And these are very, very different. Pardon me. So the point at which I want to start with, I think, is absolutely brilliantly covered in a medium that I hate. and that medium is Twitter. But I think you could find the start of more good books in Twitter than you'll ever find by doing creative writing projects at school, university, etc. And the reason is that people carefully craft their 100 and whatever it is characters message so that it's quite eye-catching. Max, you made the comment this morning about I'm in the process of making Kiwi Connection a kind of a live publishing place for all sorts of things. You made the comment about a video that I recently put out, and it had the words "sexy goddess encounters St. Paul," and you said something about the title. What did you say about that?
Just that the title seems to be what grabs people, but in addition to that, the way Google works, it looks at the title and it will come up with, say, suggesting that you might like to read or see other topics with a similar title. So that was where I saw the relevance of the word sexy goddess attracting people that are interested in that type of topic.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting, because if people did type in sexy goddess, they're not going to get my video.
Strange.
It's strange. Yeah, I
believe
couldn't
it,
agree
David.
more. But the titles become really the magnetic draw card for the book.
Yes.
And often the book will work itself around the title or the grand organizing idea. Now, I would love to see all our contributors in Kiwi Connection come together for a project that I've had at the back of my mind now for dozens of years, called the 100 Best Sermons. So it's a book of sermons, and it's where it's, I love putting out about my own sermons, but I want to be able to get 100 different sermon authors to contribute to this project. I would actually see it as a major outreach of Kiwi Connection.
Didn't we start this once?
Well, we started it, but
we got 7, the best 7 we knew.
Oh, yeah, well, okay.
You remember that?
I wrote a book called 7 Sermons on Uncommon Topics.
Yeah.
And I certainly remember that. And some of those have found their ways into my collections of sermons. But I'm more interested in what other people are writing in their sermons. And that's the kind of book that I think really lends itself to the kind of audience that's in Kiwi Connection. Any comments about that from Stuart or Max?
No, I think it's an excellent idea, if I may. And in fact, I suggested it at our church about a year ago, that we invite visiting speakers who are giving sermons to give an abstract or the total address, if they got it on, it's easily sent on in email, and build up a collection from which we had a permanent record to choose of the best. But it was discounted. It wasn't seen as interesting.
Yeah, one of the reasons I discount doing it that way is that when Max and I first set up AIM, sermons on the internet were a relatively new project, and lots of churches were just developing websites, and they put the Sunday sermons up, and now the internet is flooded with hundreds of thousands, if not millions upon millions of Christian sermons. What I'm looking for is something rather different. What I'm looking for is actually about taking the best sermon, not the ones that you had people coming to preach at your church, so you're automatically going to do it. But somehow the Kiwi Connection starts to look collectively as a group at some of the sermons, some of the worship resources. Doesn't have to be a structured 20-minute sermon. I've heard Manins speak for 2 or 3 minutes and give a brilliant sermon in a nutshell. I've heard many other preachers speak for half an hour and I walk away thinking I've not the slightest idea what that was about.
I can do that too.
Yeah. Max, any comments from you about what we're talking about here? How to write a book and get going?
Well, certainly your concept of looking for the best, a collection of the best, sounds good. But I'm very conscious that what one person thinks is the best will be very, very different from what another person will think is the best, particularly when it comes to sermons, because people have a lot of preconceived ideas. And when sermons make them uncomfortable against their preconceived ideas, they don't usually rate it as good unless it's exceptional.
I think that's a very valid comment in one sense, Max, but in another sense, all the people that participate in Kiwi Connection that want to be in this project are going to be people that are writing creatively from the outset. So their measure of criteria about what constitutes something that should be in the collection will be different from, did someone like it on the Sunday morning? How do you react to that?
Yes, no, that's very true, that your audience, if you like, being those that are involved in Kiwi Connection, is a more consistent subset of the total population, if you like.
Yeah, I think so.
And we need to learn to trust the informed opinion of people who have spent their lives in that field. You do this with your conferences, choosing papers. I've done it in music education. I've read lots of submissions of people that want to give papers, and I have to choose 7 for a particular conference. We open ourselves to that kind of process and accept it in the secular world.
Yeah, I think sometimes church committees could be a little too woolly in this, rather than being quite specific. Look, we're looking for these kinds of genres, we're looking for these sorts of expressions. We haven't got a lot of time left, so we just want to come back to process and to marketing. Stuart, have you got any particular comment that you would like to say about, once you've got the creative process going, what next? How do you go from an opening sentence to a fully blown sermon or a fully blown book?
You just keep going. There are 2 areas that I've used. Most of the institutions I've written for have their own presses. Universities, International Society journals, Katai journals, Karloff Institute journals,
Yeah.
Those. That's one way. The other way I found helpful is belonging to Kiwi Connection. This has given me a completely new way of approaching another audience, and I think it's marvelous.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize how powerful the concepts are within the idea of a collective group of people. Some of them are scientists, some of them are historians, some of them are journalists, some of them are teachers. There may only be 20 active people, there might be 140 people on the site altogether, some of whom are consumers of the resources rather than producers of them. But when you get a group of people that are interested in all kinds of resource production, and it could be, for example's sake, that one of John Brock or Brocky's photojournalistic essays ends up in the genre of best sermon. It could be that a Clive Dyson's how do I, with his designer eyes, with his ability to see things that many of us can't see, it could be that one of his videos ends up as a best sermon. It could be that some of our star writers like Lavinia Elder, a magnificent teacher with huge amounts of creative energy. And when you look at her understanding of the creative process, that in itself could be part of the best sermon. But when you put all the genres together, what we've got is the idea of a book in a very different form. Now we've also got publishers in a conventional sense. So I mentioned Philip Garside, PGPL Press, and that's great if people want to get their own collection of sermons out and published into a book format. But I suspect that the world of publishing is changing so rapidly, and what people want to read, how we market to what they want, is kind of critical to this whole exercise.
And it's a very demanding process. My first books for SOMI, The Stories for Juniors, was published by Longman Paul. And to get my first book published in that way, and not just accepted as a paper for somewhere, some university, took a long time and hours of going around publishing houses before Longman Paul said, yes, we'll do that, and we'll give you a first print of 5,000 each. Now, after 4 books, I was on my own. But that's a pretty demanding process to go through to get an outside publisher.
Yeah, and I think that's another way in which the world of publishing has changed since you wrote SOMI. And since I wrote Falling into the Center of the Universe, 7 sermons. I started to get a bit of an inkling with the possibilities of using what we've called the audio-visual ebook, the AVE, when I took a part of Adam and Eve and evolution. Now, at one stage, Max, I think the Bishop of Melbourne was partially interested in Adam and Eve and evolution with Acorn Press, and I sent it off for Acorn, and they said, oh, yeah, we'll publish it, but get rid of the Adam and Eve and evolution play. And it seemed to me that was the one thing that I wasn't going to get rid of. And so that's when AIM took it over as a project. Now, the Adam and Eve and evolution play, I think, has translated very well into an AVE. And I discovered one person had worked through, and I hadn't realized they'd worked through, so we got to issue them the Genesis and Science Open badge for it. Bit by bit, we're starting to see more and more people working through the resources, just quietly interacting with the books. So they can be works of fiction, they can be plays, they can be technical articles, they can be theology. I first got interested in publishing in this kind of way back in the early 1990s, and the then principal of the Trinity Methodist Theological College was the Reverend Frank Hansen, and he and a group of others asked if I would edit a magazine for them called the Methodist Theological Review. Now, I've still got all of those, and they were all given by the authors. The copyright was assigned out. Creative Commons didn't exist in the same way then, but the articles could be freely distributed amongst parishes for whomsoever wanted to read. So I've got a magnificent set of articles that, again, in Kiwi Connection, we're starting to look at publishing those in different formats, going back. All of these things get us into a groove, if you like, of publishing in different arenas. So Kiwi Connection can publish print, though we'd rather not. We'd rather send people to PGPL, very good publishers in print. We can publish in AVE form. We can publish in PDF if we want to. We can publish in EPUB. It's a question of how, taking your creative process and working with it. And we've been really very fortunate in having a young gun, Stuart McAdam, and Stuart and I have done a number of programs on the creative process. And what makes it so relevant there is you've got a guy in his mid-20s who's talking about these very things. How do you take the first steps? How do you get it marketed in today's world, and so on and so forth?
I wished I'd had that background when I'd started.
Yeah.
I had to do it all on my own.
Well, likewise. Well, I see that we've come almost to our 40 minutes. We've been broadcasting 39, so we have to stop in the next minute or two. Any final comments and summing up from either of you two? Anything you'd like to say, Max?
Only briefly, what comes to mind is that the work that Andrew Gammon is doing is publishing in one of those new fields of the electronic book, and not, as I understand it, not the printed.
Oh, okay. He's working with EPUB. I think he also was working with PDF and so on. And print. I have the feeling they were doing some print runs, but I'm not 100% sure.
Sure.
Stuart, any final comment from you?
No, I just think it's wonderful that you're offering this opportunity to more and more people and encouraging them to come on board, because most people have interesting stories to tell. If they've lived interesting lives, they must have.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's the challenge that we're leaving this live on air with, and that is we want to put together the 100 best sermons to give a slice of theological reflection up and down New Zealand. It could be across cultures, could be across genres, it could be not necessarily sermons or articles, it could be photojournalism. The whole thing is going to be considered, and let's get going. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you all next week when we're talking about the parable of the lost coin and what relevance that's got to the teaching of science and mathematics. And I'm delighted to be able to have Roisin Gray sitting next to me in that broadcast coming up in 7 days' time. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.